Why you always wear that uniform?
"Why you always wear that uniform?" said the little girl to her daddy, the cop. The morning sunlight poured gently through the window, painting golden patterns across the living room floor. Her father knelt by the doorway, zipping up his police jacket slowly, the sound of the zipper crisp against the quiet hum of the house. The air smelled faintly of coffee and floor polish. His boots gleamed, his badge caught the light like a small star. He smiled, the kind of smile that carried warmth but also weight. A smile that hid the thousand silent promises behind it. His daughter clutched her old teddy bear, its fur worn and patched from too many hugs. Her eyes followed him with the kind of curiosity only children hold. Pure, unfiltered, filled with love and confusion. She didn't understand the world outside the door he walked through every morning. She didn't understand why that uniform seemed to steal him away before. Breakfast was done, and sometimes didn't return until the moon was already high. He looked at her with pride and fear all at once. Pride because she was his reason. Fear because the world wasn't always kind to men who looked like him, even when they wore the badge. But he never told her that. He just bent down, fixed the small badge on his chest, and whispered promises she was too young to remember but would someday understand. As he stood, the weight of the vest and belt seemed heavier that morning. Maybe it was the quiet, maybe it was the look in her eyes, or maybe it was the memory of the night before, the call that came in just before dawn. The echo of sirens still ringing in his head. The job had taken friends, brothers in blue, and too many sleepless nights. But every time he zipped that uniform, he remembered why he did it. He had made a promise once, not just to the department, not just to the city, but to his mother, to his neighborhood, to himself, that he would be one of the good ones, that he would be the kind of man little black boys could point to and say, "He's on our side," the kind of man little black girls could trust when the world felt unsafe. He knelt once more, pressed his forehead against hers, and she giggled softly. The innocence of that sound filled the room like sunlight after a storm. He breathed it in. It was the only peace he'd have all day. As he stepped outside, the door clicked shut behind him. The sound echoed through the quiet house, leaving her alone in the doorway, hugging her teddy tighter. Through the window, she watched him walk down the driveway, each step sure and steady. She didn't see the bulletproof vest beneath his shirt. She didn't see the look in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. All she saw was her daddy, strong, smiling, a hero in blue. But the city he protected was restless. The streets whispered with tension, protests, anger, and grief had become part of the nightly rhythm. There were names painted on walls, candles burning on corners, and too many sirens in the distance. He drove through it all with his lights off sometimes, watching, thinking. He wanted to protect everyone, the ones in the neighborhoods that raised him and the ones who still feared him, because of the badge he wore. That balance between duty and identity was tearing him in half. But when he remembered his little girl's voice, soft and curious, asking why he always wore that uniform, he found his answer again. Because every morning he had to believe he could make it home. Because every night he wanted her to sleep knowing he kept his promise. Still, that morning felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, a quiet he couldn't explain. By noon, the radio crackled. A call downtown. Shots fired near the old grocery store. He turned the wheel, heart steady, siren silent. And back at home, his little girl sat by the window, humming to her teddy, waiting for her daddy to come home safe again. The call came in just after noon. The static on the radio cracked through the silence of his patrol car. Sunlight bounced off the hood as the city moved in slow motion. Kids chasing basketballs, old men leaning on porches, the faint echo of music spilling from corner stores. But underneath that rhythm was a pulse of tension, something he could feel in his chest before the dispatcher even finished speaking. Shots fired. Possible victim down. Corner of 5th and Elmont. 5th and Elmont. A neighborhood that knew his face and trusted his voice. A block from where his mother used to buy groceries. A block from where his daughter sometimes begged him to stop for ice cream. His fingers tightened around the steering wheel, and for a moment, the sound of his daughter's voice echoed in his mind. "Why you always wear that uniform, Daddy?" He hit the siren. The world blurred past. Blue lights flashed against brick walls and broken windows. He didn't feel like a cop in that moment, not the way the world saw one. He felt like a man racing towards something he could not lose. The sound of the siren became a heartbeat, one that matched his own. As he turned the corner, the scene unfolded. Chaos frozen in sunlight. A small crowd had gathered. The scent of gunpowder still hung in the air, sharp and metallic. On the ground, a young man lay still, his hoodie soaked in red. A woman screamed his name from somewhere in the crowd, but the noise felt far away. The officer dropped to his knees beside the boy, instinct taking over. He pressed his hands against the wound, trying to stop the bleeding, trying to hold life in place. "Stay with me," he whispered under his breath, though his voice was drowned by the sirens now converging on the block. Another officer ran up, back up, too late to prevent, just in time to witness. The boy's eyes opened for a moment. They were wide, frightened, searching, and in that instant, the officer saw something that made his breath catch. Those eyes, that face, they reminded him of someone. Too familiar, too close. He thought of his daughter. The way she looked at him when he zipped up his uniform. The way she believed he could stop anything bad from happening. But here he was, holding a stranger's son in his arms, fighting a losing battle against the clock. He whispered soft words that the world would never hear. A quiet prayer from a man who had said too many. By the time the ambulance arrived, the boy's pulse had faded. The crowd had grown. Phones were out. Faces were angry. And in their eyes, the badge on his chest wasn't a symbol of safety. It was something else entirely. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Some knew him, some didn't. But in that moment, none of it mattered. The boy on the ground was gone. And the officer stood slowly, his hands stained red. Not his blood, but it felt like it could have been. He stepped back, letting the medics take over. The world tilted around him. Another young life gone. Another mother's scream echoing through the street. Another reason for the city to lose faith in peace. He looked down at his hands, the same ones that had held his daughter that morning. The same ones that zipped up his uniform as she asked why he wore it every day. He rubbed his fingers together as if the guilt could be wiped clean. It couldn't. That night, he didn't go home right away. He sat in his patrol car under the dim light of a street lamp, engine idling, radio silent. He stared at the empty passenger seat, imagining his little girl's teddy bear there, the one she always clutched like it could keep her safe. The city outside didn't sleep. Blue lights flashed in the distance. Somewhere, laughter drifted from a porch. Life went on, as it always did. But inside that car, time stood still. He thought of all the calls he'd answered, all the people he'd tried to help, all the faces that blurred together over the years. And then he thought of one, a boy whose eyes reminded him of home, whose life ended in his arms. He knew the reports would come next, the questions, the statements, the press. He knew what people would say before they said it. Some would call him a hero. Some would call him the problem. Both would be wrong in their own way, because what he was, what he truly felt, was just tired. Tired of being caught in the middle. Tired of being the bridge between two worlds that never seemed to meet. Tired of carrying a promise that kept breaking in his hands. When he finally started the car again, the sky had turned to a deep orange, sunset creeping across the horizon. He drove home slowly, each mile feeling heavier than the last. At the doorstep, he paused. He could hear his daughter's laughter through the window. It was light, pure, a sound untouched by the world outside. He stood there for a long time, helmet under one arm, badge glinting faintly under the porch light. When he opened the door, the house smelled like dinner, warm and familiar. His daughter ran to him, arms wide, teddy bear bouncing in her grip. For a moment, he forgot everything. He scooped her up, spun her once, forced a smile. But she noticed. She always noticed. His eyes were tired, his shoulders low. She studied him the way children do, quietly, deeply, without needing words. And as he knelt down to her height, she pressed her tiny hand against his cheek, as if to wipe something invisible away. He hugged her tighter. In that embrace, he found the only kind of peace he'd ever known. Later that night, after she had fallen asleep, he sat alone in the dark living room. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock. His badge sat on the table beside him, catching bits of moonlight. He stared at it for a long time. It used to mean purpose. Now it just reminded him of the boy's face, and the question that never left his head. What if I couldn't protect them all? He leaned back, eyes closing, hands clasped together. He thought about the next morning, how he'd still have to put the uniform on, still have to smile for her, still have to walk out that door pretending the world was fair, because that's what he promised, to protect, to come home, to keep the faith, even when the world kept testing it. And as the night deepened, a storm began to build outside, soft at first, then steady, then fierce. Rain washed against the windows, thunder rumbling in the distance. He looked toward his daughter's door one last time before the lights went out. Tomorrow would come. The radio would crackle again, and somewhere another call would wait for him. But for now, in the silence between storms, he prayed for just one more morning to see her smile again. The storm came in slow, like it had been waiting for the right moment to break. By morning, the sky was bruised gray, heavy with rain that hadn't yet fallen. The kind of sky that made the city hold its breath. He stood in the doorway again, the same as always. Uniform pressed, badge polished, boots tied tight. But this morning felt different. The air had a weight to it. Even the sound of his daughter's laughter in the background couldn't lift it. He took one last sip of his coffee, staring at the faint reflection of himself in the kitchen window. His face looked older somehow, not from time, but from all the moments that had carved themselves into him. Nights on patrol, faces he couldn't forget, promises he couldn't keep. Behind him, the sound of small footsteps approached. His daughter appeared, dragging her teddy bear by the arm. Her pajamas rumpled, her hair still braided from yesterday. She blinked up at him, eyes wide and full of sleepy curiosity. He turned and smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach the eyes. He knelt down to her height, adjusted the little pink ribbon in her hair, and told her to be good for her mother while he was gone. She nodded. But then she said something that made his hands pause. "Daddy," she whispered, clutching her bear tight, "I had a bad dream." Her words cut through him, because lately he had been living in one too. He asked her what she dreamed about, but she didn't say. She just hugged him tighter than usual, her small hands gripping his collar like she didn't want to let go. He promised her it was just a dream, that she'd see him later for dinner, that he'd be home before bedtime. But the rain started falling before he even reached the car. The city was quieter that morning, streets slick with rain, reflections of red and blue lights rippling in the puddles. He drove past familiar blocks, past walls covered in murals of faces gone too soon, past people who looked up as his patrol car passed and then looked away. He had grown up here. These streets had shaped him long before the badge ever did. Every corner held a memory. The candy shop that used to sit on the corner before it closed down. The church where his mama used to sing in the choir. The schoolyard where he got into his first fight. Now he patrolled it, trying to keep peace in a place that never seemed to know rest. But something was shifting in the air that day, a storm deeper than the rain. By midday, the radio calls started piling up, protests forming downtown, people gathering outside City Hall, chants echoing through the wet air. Another name had made the news. Another tragedy gone viral, and the city was burning with anger again. He listened in silence as the dispatcher's voice came through giving updates. He'd been through this before. The tension, the fear, the stares that cut deeper than words. He understood it too well, because he was one of them, and yet he wasn't. He had spent his life walking, the thin line between two worlds that didn't trust each other. The community he came from and the badge he wore. Each side saw only half of him. Neither saw the whole. At the precinct, the mood was heavy. Officers moved quickly, tension thick in the air. Everyone knew what might happen tonight. The captain briefed them, told them to stay calm, stay professional, stay alive. Those last words hung longer than the rest. As the rain turned to thunder outside, he glanced at the photo taped inside his locker door. A picture of his daughter holding her teddy bear, smiling wide, missing 2 front teeth. That was his anchor, his reason, his reminder of what mattered. He touched the edge of the photo lightly before closing the locker. By late afternoon, the storm outside had turned violent. The streets were slick, the sky roaring with thunder. Crowds had gathered under umbrellas and cardboard signs, voices rising in anger and pain. He was assigned to perimeter duty, a human barrier between a crowd that demanded change and a line of officers. told to maintain order. Rain soaked through his jacket, trickling down the back of his neck. The chants were loud, steady, rhythmic. He could feel them in his chest like a drumbeat. And somewhere in that crowd, he saw familiar faces, people he'd grown up with, neighbors, church members, kids who once waved at his patrol car but now stared at him with hard eyes. One young man shouted something toward the line of officers, something sharp, filled with hurt. And though the officer couldn't hear every word, he knew what it meant. It wasn't personal. It was pain. The kind of pain that comes from generations of loss, disappointment, and unanswered prayers. He wanted to say something, to tell them he understood, that he wasn't the enemy. But in that uniform, words didn't matter. His presence alone was enough to draw the anger. Then, in an instant, chaos. A bottle flew. Someone screamed. The line wavered. Rain mixed with pepper spray, and the air turned thick with confusion. The crowd surged. Officers shouted commands. And in the blur of noise and movement, he saw someone fall. He ran toward the figure, instinct before thought. It was a teenage boy, no older than 16, lying on the wet pavement, eyes wide in panic. The officer reached down, pulling him up, shielding him from the pushing crowd. The boy's clothes were soaked, his hands shaking. "Go home," he told him, though his voice was drowned out by the storm. Go home. For a moment, their eyes met, two worlds colliding in silence. Then the boy turned and disappeared into the crowd. When the noise finally settled, he stood alone in the rain, his heart pounding, his uniform covered in mud and rain and sweat. Around him, lights flashed. Sirens wailed. The city groaned beneath the weight of its own wounds. He looked up at the sky. Lightning split it open. In that flash, he thought about his daughter, sitting at home, maybe watching the same storm through her window, waiting for the sound of his car in the driveway. He whispered a promise into the thunder, the same one he made every day. To come home, to protect, to never let the darkness win. But as he stood there, soaked and shaking, he realized something he had never said out loud. Sometimes the hardest part of protecting the world is surviving it yourself. That night, when the storm finally passed, the city was quiet again, but not peaceful, just exhausted. He drove home slowly, headlights cutting through puddles. His hands trembled on the wheel, but he didn't know why. Adrenaline, grief, maybe both. When he pulled into the driveway, the porch light was still on. Through the window, he saw her, his daughter, asleep on the couch, teddy bear clutched tight, waiting for a father she wasn't sure would come back. He stepped inside quietly, dripping rain onto the floor. The house smelled like home, candles, warmth, comfort. He sat beside her, brushing a curl from her forehead. And as he watched her sleep, he felt it again, that unshakable promise. Tomorrow he'd have to wear the uniform again. Tomorrow he'd have to face the world again. But tonight, for just a few hours, he was only daddy. He leaned back on the couch, rain still falling softly outside, the city finally at rest. The morning after the storm began with silence. Not peace, just silence. The kind that comes after everything has been said, shouted, and broken. Rain still clung to the edges of rooftops, dripping in slow, steady rhythms down the street. The air was heavy, cool, and gray. The world outside looked washed, like it had been scrubbed raw by the night before. Inside the small house, the light crept in through the curtains, touching the edge of the couch where he slept. His daughter lay curled against him, her small hand resting over his heart, her teddy bear wedged between them. He opened his eyes slowly, blinking away the fog of exhaustion. For the first time in weeks, he hadn't woken to the sound of his radio. No sirens, no static, just the quiet breathing of his little girl. Proof that at least one promise had been kept. He smiled faintly, brushing her braids away from her face. The world outside might still be on fire, but in that moment, there was peace inside the four walls of their home. He wanted to stay like that forever. But duty didn't rest, not for long. When he stood, she stirred, murmuring softly in her sleep. He paused, watching her cling to the teddy bear tighter, as if she could feel him moving away. His chest ached. Every part of him wanted to call in sick, just for one day, to stay home, to make pancakes, to live like normal people did. But he knew better. The city didn't stop for anyone, and neither could he. He showered quietly, shaved, buttoned his shirt, and pulled the vest over his chest. The familiar weight pressed against his ribs. Every piece of gear, every buckle, every click of the radio on his shoulder was part of the ritual now, part of the armor. When he reached for his badge, he hesitated. It gleamed in the dim light, but this time he saw more than metal and authority. He saw reflection, the man behind it. A man who had carried both sides of the story for too long. He pinned it on slowly like a prayer. By the time he was ready to leave, his daughter was awake. She sat on the couch, rubbing her eyes, teddy bear in her lap. Her voice was soft, but her words cut straight through him. "Daddy, do you have to go again?" He knelt down, pulling her close. She smelled like sleep and syrup, like innocence untouched. He told her yes, because protecting people was what he promised to do. Because there were still those who needed help, who needed to know someone cared. But then she asked him something he wasn't ready for. "Do you promise to come back?" His breath caught. He looked into her eyes, and in them, he saw everything he was fighting for. Love, trust, the future. He placed a hand over her heart and whispered, "Always." That word, always, felt both heavy and sacred. She smiled, kissed his cheek, and ran to the window like she always did, waving as he walked toward the car. Her teddy bear waved with her, its paw pressed against the glass. He waved back the way he did every morning. And then he was gone. The day started quietly, almost deceptively calm. The storm had broken, and the city was trying to heal. Streets still shimmered with puddles, and news crews were out filming the aftermath. The protests had died down, but their echoes lingered. Chalk names still written on the sidewalks. Candles burned down to wax puddles, murals half finished but still glowing with color. He drove slowly, eyes scanning the neighborhoods. Familiar faces nodded at him from porches. For the first time in a while, people didn't just see a uniform. They saw him. Maybe it was the way he treated people. Maybe it was the way he'd carried himself through the chaos. Or maybe they just saw what he carried. Inside, the burden of a man who had never stopped trying to protect both sides. That morning, he responded to small things. A lost wallet, a stalled car, a frightened mother whose son hadn't come home last night. Ordinary things, real things, things that reminded him why he started this job. He stopped by a school crossing, helping kids make it safely across the wet street. One little boy looked up at him and said, "You look like my dad." He smiled, nodded, and watched the boy run to the other side. The city was full of moments like that. Small, fragile pieces of hope hiding inside the cracks. But hope doesn't erase danger. By late afternoon, a call came in from dispatch. An armed robbery in progress, 2 blocks from the park. The kind of call that sends adrenaline shooting through your veins. He turned on his siren and hit the gas. Tires splashed through puddles. The city blurred by again, just like before. But this time, something in his chest was different, steadier, calmer. He arrived before backup. The store's front window was shattered, alarms blaring. Inside, he could see movement, a young man, nervous, holding a gun that shook in his hands. The officer took cover, calling out commands through the rain and chaos. The young man's breathing was frantic, fear more than rage. He wasn't a hardened criminal, just a scared boy trying to survive a world that gave him too few chances. The officer could see that now. He moved slowly, carefully, talking the boy down inch by inch. Rain soaked through his collar. His heart pounded in his ears. He thought of his daughter, her voice, her smile, her question. "Do you promise to come back?" He did what he always did, protected, calmed, chose life over violence. When the boy finally dropped the gun, the officer moved forward. Hand steady, voice low, eyes soft. He cuffed him gently, guided him out into the rain. The sirens of backup cars echoed down the street as other officers arrived. And in that moment, soaked, exhausted, alive, he felt it. The promise kept, not just to his daughter, but to every kid like that boy. Scared, lost, still deserving of another chance. He drove home that night in silence. The rain had stopped. The sky had cleared. For once, the city felt quiet again. Not empty, but breathing. When he pulled into his driveway, the porch light flicked on. The front door opened before he could even turn off the engine. His daughter stood there, smiling wide, teddy bear in her arms. He stepped inside, and she ran to him, wrapping her arms around his legs. He lifted her up, and she looked at him with sleepy eyes full of warmth. "See, Daddy?" she said softly. You came back. He laughed, that tired, honest kind of laugh that comes after surviving something heavy. I told you I would. She looked at his uniform, still damp, still marked from the day, and asked again, in that small voice only she had, Is that why you always wear it? He nodded. Because that was the truth. He wore it not just to protect strangers, not just for duty or law or pride, but because every morning when he zipped it up, it was a reminder, a promise stitched into fabric and faith, a promise to protect, a promise to come home, a promise to show his daughter that heroes can look like her family, too. That night, as he tucked her into bed, the world outside was finally quiet. He turned off the light, kissed her forehead, and stood for a long moment at the door, watching her drift into dreams. Then he looked at the uniform hanging by the chair, the badge catching a sliver of moonlight. He smiled. Because for once it didn't just feel like armor, it felt like purpose.